Hi there. Today we're going to talk about Edmund Spenser's Sonnet 75 that I more commonly just call One Day I Wrote Her Name Upon the Strand. And we're going to be looking at this sonnet in terms of its structure, but we'll also be looking at any other poetic devices that are interesting that are used, and we'll be asking our three questions about this sonnet at the end. Spenser is not as favorite a poet to me as Shakespeare. I find him a little more stilted and artificial, and I find Shakespeare more natural. But students really do particularly like this poem, and I do like that it has like three characters in it. It has a man, a woman, and the ocean, and a location. You know, they're on the beach. A lot of Shakespeare's poems do seem to just like fall out of the sky or be emotional outbursts, and they're not really at a location. That makes them universal, and you can put them anywhere. But sometimes it's nice to have a little bit of concrete setting. So this is a sonnet that's basically about a man who wants to show how much he loves his beloved. And he wants to do it in ways that we sometimes see even in our time period, which is where a guy might get a tattoo. You know, a tattoo is permanent, and I'll put your name on my arm. I hope you don't do this, but I might carve our initials in a tree to show how permanent my love is for you. And since I'm from the South, sometimes we might climb up a water tower and spray paint Ron loves Doris or something like that for the whole town to see. Now, I'm not advocating vandalism, but it is, something that we do see now and then. Here, we have something that you still see, which is a guy wrote something on the beach, and he wrote her name. I've seen marriage proposals, written out on the beach, or big hearts or things like that when I've been, staying in a hotel and can look down on the beach and see that somebody's making the big swing, making the big statement. So when we look at this sonnet, it opens with the man's action. If I were going to look at the structure, I can read the whole sonnet to you, but I'll just sort of go through it as we do each part. But generally, we have one part right here. We have the man doing two actions. He writes the woman's name on the strand, and then the waves wash it away. So he writes it again, and the waves come back and do it a second time. And so we have sort of, section one of this poem is sort of what I would call the man's actions. Because he does it twice. And then we have the woman's response in the next part. And so that's what in the next four lines. And that makes two quatrains, two four-line stanzas into one octave. And it's traditional in a lot of sonnets, and we always need to be sensitive to that. Where is the volta? Where is the turn occurring? And it's often occurring between the eighth line and the ninth line, between the octave and the sestet, as we like to say. And we often find the word but or not located right here where something's contrasted. Here we get the man's response. He's going to be critiqued by the woman for being vain and foolish in the middle of the poem, and he gets the last word. It's a little unfair. And she, excuse me, and she in this poem is our typical Petrarchan mistress. She is critical and cold and kind of distant. So in a lot of Renaissance sonnets, we have a man who's filled with passion and heat and longing, and we have the cold Petrarchan mistress. We call her the Petrarchan mistress because the originator of the sonnet, Francesco Petrarch, was in love with a woman named Laura, and he wrote over 300 sonnets to her, and she was always kind of like this to him. All it did was make him, want to write another sonnet. Maybe this one will win her over, but she was always cold. So let's take a look at, this is how the sonnet is built. Man does actions, woman critiques, man kind of critiques the woman's critique. And we'll see how the five great Renaissance subjects show up in this poem. So let's take a look closely at the poem. Our speaker says, "One day I wrote her name upon the strand, but came the waves and washed it away. Again I wrote it with a second hand, but came the tide and made my pains his prey." An active sentence. He's doing actions here, writing her name upon the strand. One thing that we want to know, sonnets are a particularly beautiful little jewelry box. They have lots of fancy poetic devices. They're sort of like ultimate poetry, if you want to look at it that way. And one of the most common techniques to make a poem beautiful is, of course, alliteration. It just sounds good to the ear, associates words together, and can be quite beautiful. So we just noticed the waves and washed it away. I wrote it with a second hand, and the tide made my pains his prey. We also notice that the tide is kind of personified here. I often see it as shark-like because of the diction of the word prey. The word prey makes us think of predators, and the tide seems to be like some sort of shark that's like grabbing the name and taking it away. So pains and prey, not only is it alliterative, but it also personifies the tide and gives a sense of energy to it. But we see how much he loves his girl, right? He's writing her name, and then that's taken away, but then he writes it again. And you would think that she would be appreciative of his efforts, but she is not. Instead, we see another technique of poetry, and not just poetry, but prose as well, which is repetition. She uses the word vain twice, right? And she critiques him. She's not impressed. She very haughty. Her language, her dialogue, which you don't see much dialogue in English Renaissance poetry, it characterizes her as sort of a kind of haughty woman, kind of proud. Vain man, said she, that dost in vain essay. See how, Spenser has kind of artificial words. I know most people think of Shakespeare that way, but Shakespeare doesn't say essay very much. It just means to try. You're trying to do something in vain. You are trying to immortalize a mortal thing. Vain man, said she, that dost in vain essay a mortal thing so to immortalize. For I myself shall like to this decay, and also my name be wiped out likewise. Like a lot of proud people, she seems to be kind of mock humble at the end. She's like, you are so vain and silly to try to immortalize something when I know that I am just a human being and will pass away, and so will my name. So in some ways, I like to draw arrows when I analyze sonnets to sort of see that this is kind of an upward movement of the poem. He's like, I'm going to make your name last forever. And then this is kind of a negative downward to the poem where she's like, you cannot do that. And then in the very final part of the poem, the man gets to speak and tell her that she's wrong. Not so, quoth I. Let baser things devise to die in dust. We see that lovely alliteration there. Let baser things devise to die in dust, but you shall live by fame. We have a colon there, and that's sort of a good stopping place, to sort of understand that syntactic unit. He explains how she shall live by fame, and just like we've seen with all the 5 great Renaissance subjects, her fame is going to live, and her name is going to live in poetry. Poetry is what can defeat time. He says, my verse, your virtues rare, shall eternize, and in the heavens write your glorious name, where when as death shall all the world subdue, our love shall live, and later life renew. He has a nice rhyming couplet, that's very Shakespearean there, even though, remember, this is Spenser, not Shakespeare, where he says that our love will be memorialized in this poem, and when other people read about it, our love lives again, and it inspires them to love as well. Now, I want to emphasize that alliteration is never particularly meaningful. It associates words together, but it's mostly just decoration. But we do see that there are times when he uses 3 words in a line that alliterate, but here we have love, live, later, and life. And the L sound in English is particularly lovely. It's called a liquid, and it's kind of fun to say. But we have 4 of them in the same line, and that's kind of like the fireworks at the end of the sonnet. It's subtle, but it is sort of more dramatic. But we see, the same old theme. English Renaissance sonnets are like broken records. They're always saying that love and beauty will defeat time and death through poetry. And we see this is an example of a sonnet that does that as well. So I like to step back and sort of, ask 3 questions about the sonnet. And one is, where does it begin and where does it end? Well, it begins with a man doing actions of love. Then he is being critiqued for doing those actions. But then he triumphs over that critique and says that he actually wins the game and he's in the right. So it moves toward a triumphant, successful argument. If I had to pick the most important word in this poem, that's always debatable, but I kind of like eternize because it's a weird word. Where maybe it's not as weird as the word immortalize. We understand that, to turn something into immortal. But I like the word eternize because it's not one we use, to make something eternal. And that's what the poem's about. How do I make something last forever? The last question I like to ask is, what's the purpose of this poem, or what is this poem? This poem is a celebration of the power of poetry. And it is also meant to celebrate the beauty of the woman, even though she might not seem worth celebrating since she seems pretty ungrateful to be loved that way. But there always is something interesting, some sort of war between the sexes that are always going on in these old sonnets.